Microsoft Visual Studio is an integrated development environment for Microsoft. It is used to develop computer programs for Microsoft Windows superfamily of operating systems, as well as websites, web applications and web services. Visual Studio uses Microsoft software development platforms such as Windows API, Windows Forms, Windows Presentation Foundation, Windows Store and Microsoft Silverlight. It can produce both native code and managed code. Visual Studio includes a code editor supporting IntelliSense as well as code refactoring. The integrated debugger works both as a source-level debugger and a machine-level debugger. Other built-in tools include a Forms Designer for building GUI applications, Web Designer, Class Designer, and Database Schema Designer. It accepts plugins that enhance the functionality at almost every level including adding support for source control systems and adding new toolsets like editors and visual designers for domain-specific languages or toolsets for other aspects of the software development lifecycle. Visual Studio supports different programming languages and allows the code editor and debugger to support nearly any programming language, provided a language-specific service exists. Built-in languages include C, C++, and C++/CLI, VB.NET, C, and F. Support for other languages such as M, Python, and Ruby among others is available via language services installed separately. It also supports XML XSLT, HTML XHTML, JavaScript and CSS. Microsoft provides express editions of its Visual Studio at no cost. Commercial versions of Visual Studio along with select past versions are available for free to students via Microsoft's Dream Spark program. Architecture: Visual Studio does not support any programming language, solution or tool intrinsically, instead it allows the plugging of functionality coded as a VS package. When installed, the functionality is available as a service. The IDE provides three services: SVS Solution, which provides the ability to enumerate projects and solutions; SVS Shell, which provides windowing and UI functionality; and SVS Shell, which deals with registration of VS packages. In addition, the IDE is also responsible for coordinating and enabling communication between services. All editors, designers, project types and other tools are implemented as VS packages. Visual Studio uses COM to access the VS packages. The Visual Studio SDK also includes the Managed Package Framework, which is a set of managed wrappers around the COM interfaces that allow the packages to be written in any CLI-compliant language. However, Wpf does not provide all the functionality exposed by the Visual Studio COM interfaces. The services can then be consumed for creation of other packages, which add functionality to the Visual Studio IDE. Support for programming languages is added by using a specific VS package called a language service. A language service defines various interfaces which the VS package implementation can implement to add support for various functionalities. Functionalities that can be added this way include syntax coloring, statement completion, brace matching, parameter information tooltips, member lists and error markers for background compilation. If the interface is implemented, the functionality will be available for the language. Language services are to be implemented on a per-language basis. The implementations can reuse code from the parser or the compiler for the language. Language services can be implemented either in native code or managed code. For native code, either the native COM interfaces or the Babel framework can be used. For managed code, the Wpf includes wrappers for writing managed language services. Visual Studio does not include any source control support built-in, but it defines two alternative ways for source control systems to integrate with the IDE. A source control VS package can provide its own customized user interface. In contrast, a source control plugin using the MSSCCI provides a set of functions that are used to implement various source control functionality, with a standard Visual Studio user interface. MSSCCI was first used to integrate Visual Sourcesafe with Visual Studio 6.0 but was later opened up via the Visual Studio SDK. Visual Studio.NET 2002 used MSSCCI 1.1, and Visual Studio.NET 2003 used MSSCCI 1.2. Visual Studio 2005, 2008 and 2010 use MSSCCI version 1.3, which adds support for rename and delete propagation as well as asynchronous opening. Visual Studio supports running multiple instances of the environment. The instances use different registry hives to store their configuration state and are differentiated by their APPID. The instances are launched by an APPID-specific X that selects the APPID, sets the root hive and launches the IDE. VS packages registered for one APPID are integrated with other VS packages for that APPID. The various product editions of Visual Studio are created using the different APPIDs. The Visual Studio Express Edition products are installed with their own APPIDs, but the standard, professional and team suite products share the same APPID. Consequently, one can install the Express Edition side by side with other editions, unlike the other editions which update the same installation. The Professional Edition includes a superset of the VS packages in the Standard Edition, and the Team Suite includes a superset of the VS packages in both other editions. The APPID system is leveraged by the Visual Studio Shell in Visual Studio 2008. Features: Code Editor. Like any other IDE, it includes a code editor that supports syntax highlighting and code completion using IntelliSense for not only variables, functions and methods but also language constructs like loops and queries. IntelliSense is supported for the included languages, as well as for XML and for cascading style sheets and JavaScript when developing websites and web applications. Autocomplete suggestions are popped up in a modeless list box, overlaid on top of the code editor. In Visual Studio 2008 onwards, it can be made temporarily semi-transparent to see the code obstructed by it. The code editor is used for all supported languages. The Visual Studio Code Editor also supports setting bookmarks in code for quick navigation. Other navigational aids include collapsing code blocks and incremental search, in addition to normal text search and regex search. The code editor also includes a multi-item clipboard and a task list. The code editor supports code snippets, which are saved templates for repetitive code and can be inserted into code and customized for the project being worked on. A management tool for code snippets is built in as well. These tools are surfaced as floating windows which can be set to automatically hide when unused or docked to the side of the screen. The Visual Studio Code Editor also supports code refactoring, including parameter reordering, variable and method renaming, interface extraction and encapsulation of class members inside properties, among others. Visual Studio features background compilation. As code is being written, Visual Studio compiles it in the background in order to provide feedback about syntax and compilation errors, which are flagged with a red wavy underline. Warnings are marked with a green underline. Background compilation does not generate executable code, since it requires a different compiler than the one used to generate executable code. Background compilation was initially introduced with Microsoft Visual Basic but has now been expanded for all included languages. Debugger. Visual Studio includes a debugger that works both as a source-level debugger and as a machine-level debugger. It works with both managed code as well as native code and can be used for debugging applications written in any language supported by Visual Studio. In addition, it can also attach to running processes and monitor and debug those processes. If source code for the running process is available, it displays the code as it is being run. If source code is not available, it can show the disassembly. The Visual Studio Debugger can also create memory dumps as well as load them later for debugging. Multi-threaded programs are also supported. The debugger can be configured to be launched when an application running outside the Visual Studio environment crashes. The debugger allows setting breakpoints and watches. Breakpoints can be conditional, meaning they get triggered when the condition is met. Code can be stepped over, that is, run one line at a time. It can either step into functions to debug inside it, or step over it, that is, the execution of the function body isn't available for manual inspection. The debugger supports edit and continue, that is, it allows code to be edited as it is being debugged. When debugging, if the mouse pointer hovers over any variable, its current value is displayed in a tooltip, where it can also be modified if desired. During coding, the Visual Studio Debugger lets certain functions be invoked manually from the immediate tool window. The parameters to the method are supplied at the immediate window. Designer. Visual Studio includes a host of visual designers to aid in the development of applications. These tools include Windows Forms Designer. The Windows Forms Designer is used to build GUI applications using Windows Forms. Layout can be controlled by housing the controls inside other containers or locking them to the side of the form. Controls that display data can be bound to data sources like databases or queries. Data-bound controls can be created by dragging items from the data sources window onto a design surface. The UI is linked with code using an event-driven programming model. The designer generates either C or VB.NET code for the application. Wpf Designer. The Wpf Designer, codenamed Cider, was introduced with Visual Studio 2008. Like the Windows Forms Designer, it supports the drag-and-drop metaphor. It is used to author user interfaces targeting Windows Presentation Foundation. It supports all WPF functionality including data binding and automatic layout management. It generates XAML code for the UI. The generated XAML file is compatible with Microsoft Expression Design, the designer-oriented product. The XAML code is linked with code using the code behind model. Web Designer Development. Visual Studio also includes a website editor and designer that allows web pages to be authored by dragging and dropping widgets. It is used for developing ASP.NET applications and supports HTML, CSS and JavaScript. It uses a code behind model to link with ASP.NET code. From Visual Studio 2008 onwards, the layout engine used by the web designer is shared with Microsoft Expression Web. There is also ASP.NET MVC support for MVC technology as a separate download and ASP.NET Dynamic Data project available from Microsoft. Class Designer. The Class Designer is used to author and edit the classes using UML modeling. The Class Designer can generate C and VB.NET code outlines for the classes and methods. It can also generate class diagrams from handwritten classes. Data Designer. The Data Designer can be used to graphically edit database schemas, including type tables, primary and foreign keys and constraints. It can also be used to design queries from the graphical view. Mapping Designer. From Visual Studio 2008 onwards, the Mapping Designer is used by LINQ to SQL to design the mapping between database schemas and the classes that encapsulate the data. The new solution from ORM Approach, ADO.NET Entity Framework, replaces and improves the old technology. Other tools. Open Tabs Browser. The Open Tabs Browser is used to list all open tabs and to switch between them. It is invoked using CTRL plus TAB. Properties Editor. The Properties Editor tool is used to edit properties in a GUI pane inside Visual Studio. It lists all available properties for all objects including classes, forms, web pages and other items. Object Browser. The Object Browser is a namespace and class library browser for Microsoft.NET. It can be used to browse the namespaces in managed assemblies. The hierarchy may or may not reflect the organization in the file system. Solution Explorer. In Visual Studio parlance, a solution is a set of code files and other resources that are used to build an application. The files in a solution are arranged hierarchically, which might or might not reflect the organization in the file system. The Solution Explorer is used to manage and browse the files in a solution. Team Explorer. Team Explorer is used to integrate the capabilities of Team Foundation Server, the revision control system, into the IDE. In addition to source control, it provides the ability to view and manage individual work items and to browse TFS statistics. It is included as part of a TFS install and is also available as a download for Visual Studio separately. Team Explorer is also available as a standalone environment solely to access TFS services. Data Explorer. Data Explorer is used to manage databases on Microsoft SQL Server instances. It allows creation and alteration of database tables. It can also be used to create queries and stored procedures, with the latter in either TSQL or in managed code via SQL CLR. Debugging and IntelliSense support is available as well. Server Explorer. The Server Explorer tool is used to manage database connections on an accessible computer. It is also used to browse running Windows services, performance counters, Windows event log and message queues and use them as a data source. Obfuscator Software Services Community Edition. Visual Studio includes a free light version of Preemptive Solutions Obfuscator product for code obfuscation and application size reduction. Starting with Visual Studio 2010, this version of Obfuscator will include runtime intelligence capabilities that allow authors to gather end-user usage, performance, and stability information from their applications running in production. Text Generation Framework. Visual Studio includes a full text generation framework called T4 which enables Visual Studio to generate text files from templates either in the IDE or via code. ASP.NET Website Administration Tool. The ASP.NET Website Administration Tool allows for the configuration of ASP.NET websites. Visual Studio Tools for Office. Visual Studio Tools for Office is a SDK and an add-in for Visual Studio that includes tools for developing for the Microsoft Office suite. Previously it was a separate SKU that supported only Visual C and Visual Basic languages or was included in the Team suite. With Visual Studio 2008, it is no longer a separate SKU but is included with Professional and Higher editions. A separate runtime is required when deploying VSTO solutions. Extensibility. Visual Studio allows developers to write extensions for Visual Studio to extend its capabilities. These extensions plug into Visual Studio and extend its functionality. Extensions come in the form of macros, add-ins, and packages. Macros represent repeatable tasks and actions that developers can record programmatically for saving, replaying, and distributing. Macros, however, cannot implement new commands or create tool windows. They are written using Visual Basic and are not compiled. Add-ins provide access to the Visual Studio object model and can interact with the IDE tools. Add-ins can be used to implement new functionality and can add new tool windows. Add-ins are plugged into the IDE via COM and can be created in any COM-compliant languages. Packages are created using the Visual Studio SDK and provide the highest level of extensibility. They can create designers and other tools, as well as integrate other programming languages. The Visual Studio SDK provides unmanaged APIs as well as a managed API to accomplish these tasks. However, the managed API isn't as comprehensive as the unmanaged one. Extensions are supported in the standard versions of Visual Studio 2005. Express editions do not support hosting extensions. Visual Studio 2008 introduced the Visual Studio shell that allows for development of a customized version of the IDE. The Visual Studio shell defines a set of packages that provide the functionality required in any IDE. On top of that, other packages can be added to customize the installation. The isolated mode of the shell creates a new app where the packages are installed. These are to be started with a different executable. It is aimed for development of custom development environments either for a specific language or a specific scenario. The integrated mode installs the packages into the app of the professional team system editions, so that the tools integrate into these editions. The Visual Studio shell is available as a free download. After the release of Visual Studio 2008, Microsoft created the Visual Studio Gallery. It serves as the central location for posting information about extensions to Visual Studio. Community developers as well as commercial developers can upload information about their extensions to Visual Studio.NET 2002 through Visual Studio 2010. Users of the site can rate and review the extensions to help assess the quality of extensions being posted. RSS feeds to notify users on updates to the site and tagging features are also planned. Supported products: Microsoft Visual C++. Microsoft Visual C++ is Microsoft's implementation of the C and C++ compiler and associated languages, services and specific tools for integration with the Visual Studio IDE. It can compile either in C mode or C++ mode. For C, it follows the ISO C standard with parts of C99 specification along with MIS-specific additions in the form of libraries. For C++, it follows the ANSI C++ specification along with a few C++11 features. It also supports the C++/CLI specification to write managed code, as well as mixed-mode code. Microsoft positions Visual C++ for development in native code or in code that contains both native as well as managed components. Visual C++ supports COM as well as the MFC library. For MFC development, it provides a set of wizards for creating and customizing MFC boilerplate code, and creating GUI applications using MFC. Visual C++ can also use the Visual Studio Forms Designer to design UI graphically. Visual C++ can also be used with a Windows API. It also supports the use of intrinsic functions, which are functions recognized by the compiler itself and not implemented as a library. Intrinsic functions are used to expose the SSE instruction set of modern CPUs. Visual C++ also includes the OpenMP specification. Microsoft Visual C. Microsoft's implementation of the C language, targets the .NET framework, along with the language services that lets the Visual Studio IDE support C projects. While the language services are a part of Visual Studio, the compiler is available separately as a part of the .NET framework. The Visual C number 2008, 2010 and 2012 compilers support versions 3.0, 4.0 and 5.0 of the C language specifications, respectively. Visual C supports the Visual Studio Class Designer, Forms Designer, and Data Designer among others. Microsoft Visual Basic. Microsoft Visual Basic is Microsoft's implementation of the VB.NET language and associated tools and language services. It was introduced with Visual Studio.NET. Microsoft has positioned Visual Basic for rapid application development. Visual Basic can be used to author both console applications as well as GUI applications. Like Visual C, Visual Basic also supports the Visual Studio Class Designer, Forms Designer, and Data Designer among others. Like C, the VB.NET compiler is also available as a part of .NET Framework, but the language services that let VB.NET projects be developed with Visual Studio are available as a part of the latter. Microsoft Visual Web Developer. Microsoft Visual Web Developer is used to create websites, web applications and web services using ASP.NET. Either C or VB.NET languages can be used. Visual Web Developer can use the Visual Studio Web Designer to graphically design web page layouts. Team Foundation Server, included only with Visual Studio Teams System, Team Foundation Server is intended for collaborative software development projects and acts as the server-side backend providing source control, data collection, reporting, and project tracking functionality. It also includes the Team Explorer, the client tool for TFS services, which is integrated inside Visual Studio Team System. Previous products: Visual Foxpro. Visual Foxpro is a data-centric object-oriented and procedural programming language produced by Microsoft. It derives from Foxpro, which was developed by Fox Software beginning in 1984. Visual Foxpro is tightly integrated with its own relational database engine, which extends Foxpro's X-Base capabilities to support SQL queries and data manipulation. Visual Foxpro is a full-featured, dynamic programming language that does not require the use of an additional general-purpose programming environment. Microsoft announced in 2007 that Visual Foxpro has been discontinued after version 9 Service Pack 2, but will remain supported until 2015. Visual Sourcesafe. Microsoft Visual Sourcesafe is a source control software package oriented towards small software development projects. The Sourcesafe database is a multi-user, multi-process file system database, using the Windows file system database primitives to provide locking and sharing support. All versions are multi-user, using SMB networking. However, with Visual Sourcesafe 2005, other client server modes were added, LAN Booster and VSS Internet. Visual Sourcesafe 6.0 was available as a standalone product and was included with Visual Studio 6.0, and other products such as Office Developer Edition. Visual Sourcesafe 2005 was available as a standalone product and included with the 2005 Team Suite. Team Foundation Server has superseded VSS as Microsoft's recommended platform for source control. Microsoft Visual J++ / Microsoft Visual J. Microsoft Visual J++ was Microsoft's implementation of the Java language and associated language services. It was discontinued as a result of litigation from Sun Microsystems, and the technology was recycled into Visual J. Microsoft's Java compiler for .NET Framework J was available with Visual Studio 2005 but was discontinued in Visual Studio 2008. Visual InterDev. Visual InterDev was used to create web applications using Microsoft Active Server Pages technologies. It supports code completion and includes database server management tools. It has been replaced with Microsoft Visual Web Developer. Editions. Microsoft Visual Studio is available in the following editions or SKUs: Visual Studio Express. Visual Studio Express editions are a set of free lightweight individual IDEs which are provided as stripped-down versions of the Visual Studio IDE on a per-platform basis or per-language basis, that is, it installs the development tools for the supported platforms or supported development languages onto individual Visual Studio Shell app-IDEs. It includes only a small set of tools as compared to the other systems. It does not include support for plugins. x64 compilers are not included in the Visual Studio Express Edition IDEs, but are available as part of a Windows software development kit that can be installed separately. After an initial announcement that the Express 2012 release would be restricted to creating Windows 8 Metro-style applications, Microsoft responded to negative developer feedback by reversing that decision and announcing that desktop application development would also be supported. Microsoft targets the Express IDEs at students and hobbyists. Express editions do not use the full MSDN library but use the MSDN Essentials library. The languages available as part of the Express IDEs are Visual Basic Express, Visual C++ Express, Visual C Express, Visual Web Developer Express, Express for Windows Phone, Visual Studio Professional. Visual Studio Professional Edition provides an IDE for all supported development languages. As of Visual Studio 2010, the Standard Edition was dropped. MSDN support is available as MSDN Essentials or the full MSDN library depending on licensing. It supports XML and XSLT editing, and can create deployment packages that only use ClickOnce and MSI. It includes tools like Server Explorer and integration with Microsoft SQL Server also. Windows Mobile development support was included in Visual Studio 2005 Standard, however, with Visual Studio 2008, it is only available in Professional and higher editions. Windows Phone 7 development support was added to all editions in Visual Studio 2010. Development for Windows Mobile is no longer supported in Visual Studio 2010. It is superseded by Windows Phone 7. Visual Studio Premium. Visual Studio Premium Edition includes all of the tools in Visual Studio Professional and adds additional functionality such as code metrics, profiling, static code analysis, and database unit testing. Visual Studio Ultimate. Visual Studio Ultimate provides a set of software and database development, collaboration, metrics, architecture, testing and reporting tools in addition to the features provided by Visual Studio Premium. As of Visual Studio 2010, the Team Suite Edition was renamed to the Ultimate Edition. Visual Studio Ultimate offers a superset of toolsets based on the application lifecycle management role it is being used for. Visual Studio Test Professional. Visual Studio Test Professional is an addition which was introduced with Visual Studio 2010. Its focus is aimed at the dedicated tester role and includes support for the management of test environments, the ability to start and report on tests and to connect to Team Foundation server. It does not include support for development or authoring of tests. Additions feature grid, history. Prior to Visual Studio version 4.0, there were Visual Basic 3, Visual C++, Visual Foxpro and Visual Sourcesafe as separate products. Visual Studio 97, Microsoft first released Visual Studio in 1997, bundling many of its programming tools together for the first time. Visual Studio 97 came in two editions, Visual Studio Professional and Visual Studio Enterprise. The Professional edition has 3 CDs, and the Enterprise on 4 CDs. It included Visual J++ 1.1 for Java programming and introduced Visual IntelliSense for creating dynamically generated websites using active server pages. There was a single companion CD that contained the Microsoft Developer Network library. Visual Studio 97 was Microsoft's first attempt at using the same development environment for multiple languages. Visual J++, IntelliDev, and the MSDN library had all been using the same environment, called Developer Studio. Visual Studio was also sold as a bundle with the separate IDEs used for Visual C++, Visual Basic and Visual Foxpro. Visual Studio 6.0, the next version, version 6.0, was released in June 1998 and is the last version to run on the Windows 9X platform. Each version of each language in part also settled to v6.0, including Visual J++, which was prior v1.1, and Visual IntelliDev at the first release. The v6 edition of Microsoft was the core environment for the next 4 releases to provide programmers with an integrated lookalike platform. This led Microsoft to transition the development on the platform-independent .NET framework. Visual Studio 6.0 was the last version to include Visual J++, which Microsoft removed as part of a settlement with Sun Microsystems that required Microsoft Internet Explorer not to provide support for the Java Virtual Machine. Visual Studio 6.0 came in 2 editions, Professional and Enterprise. The Enterprise edition contained extra features not found in Professional edition, including Application Performance Explorer, Automation Manager, Microsoft Visual Modeler, REM Auto Connection Manager, Visual Studio Analyzer, Visual Studio.NET. Microsoft released Visual Studio.NET, codenamed Rainier, in February 2002. The biggest change was the introduction of a managed code development environment using the .NET framework. Programs developed using .NET are not compiled to machine language but instead to a format called Microsoft Intermediate Language or Common Intermediate Language. When a CIL application executes, it is compiled while being executed into the appropriate machine language for the platform it is being executed on, thereby making code portable across several platforms. Programs compiled into CIL can be executed only on platforms which have an implementation of common language infrastructure. It is possible to run CIL programs in Linux or Mac OS X using non-Microsoft.NET implementations like Mono and .NU. This was the first version of Visual Studio to require an NT-based Windows platform. The installer enforces this requirement. Visual Studio.NET 2002 shipped in 4 editions, Academic, Professional, Enterprise Developer, and Enterprise Architect. Microsoft introduced C, a new programming language, that targets .NET. It also introduced the successor to Visual J++ called Visual J. Visual J programs use Java's language syntax. However, unlike Visual J++ programs, Visual J programs can only target the .NET framework, not the Java virtual machine that all other Java tools target. Visual Basic changed drastically to fit the new framework, and the new version was called Visual Basic.NET. Microsoft also added extensions to C++, called Managed Extensions for C++, so .NET programs could be created in C++. Visual Studio.NET can produce applications targeting Windows, the web and, with an add-in, portable devices. The Visual Studio.NET environment was rewritten to partially use .NET. All languages are versions of Visual Studio. It has a cleaner interface and greater cohesiveness. It is also more customizable with tool windows that automatically hide when not in use. While Visual Foxpro 7 started out as part of Visual Studio.NET 2002, and early versus betas allowed debugging inside VFP-based DLLs, it was removed before release to follow its own development track. The internal version number of Visual Studio.NET 2002 is version 7.0. Microsoft released Service Pack 1 for Visual Studio.NET 2002 in March 2005. Visual Studio.NET 2003, in April 2003, Microsoft introduced a minor upgrade to Visual Studio.NET called Visual Studio.NET 2003, codenamed Everett. It includes an upgrade to the .NET framework, version 1.1, and is the first release to support developing programs for mobile devices, using ASP.NET or the .NET Compact framework. The Visual C++ compiler's standards compliance improved, especially in the area of partial template specialization. Visual C++ Toolkit 2003 is a version of the same C++ compiler shipped with Visual Studio.NET 2003 without the IDE that Microsoft made freely available. As of 2010 it is no longer available and the Express editions have superseded it. The internal version number of Visual Studio.NET 2003 is version 7.1 while the file format version is 8.0. Visual Studio.NET 2003 shipped in 4 editions: Academic, Professional, Enterprise Developer, and Enterprise Architect. The Visual Studio.NET 2003 Enterprise Architect Edition includes an implementation of Microsoft Visio 2002's modeling technologies, including tools for creating unified modeling language-based visual representations of an application's architecture, and an object role modeling and logical database modeling solution. Enterprise templates were also introduced, to help larger development teams standardize coding styles and enforce policies around component usage and property settings. Service Pack 1 was released September 13, 2006. Visual Studio 2005, Visual Studio 2005, codenamed Wpf, was released online in October 2005 and to retail stores a few weeks later. Microsoft removed the NET moniker from Visual Studio 2005, but it still primarily targets the .NET framework, which was upgraded to version 2.0. It is the last version available for Windows 2000 and also the last version to be able to target Windows 98, Windows ME and Windows NT 4.0 for C++ applications. Visual Studio 2005's internal version number is 8.0 while the file format version is 9.0. Microsoft released Service Pack 1 for Visual Studio 2005 on December 14, 2006. An additional update for Service Pack 1 that offers Windows Vista compatibility was made available on June 3, 2007. Visual Studio 2005 was upgraded to support all the new features introduced in .NET Framework 2.0, including generics and ASP.NET 2.0. The IntelliSense feature in Visual Studio was upgraded for generics and new project types were added to support ASP.NET Web Services. Visual Studio 2005 also includes a local web server, separate from IIS, that can host ASP.NET applications during development and testing. It also supports all SQL Server 2005 databases. Database designers were upgraded to support the ADO.NET 2.0, which is included with .NET Framework 2.0. C++ also got a similar upgrade with the addition of C++/CLI, which is slated to replace the use of managed C++. Other new features of Visual Studio 2005 include the Deployment Designer, which allows application designs to be validated before deployments, an improved environment for web publishing when combined with ASP.NET 2.0 and load testing to see application performance under various sorts of user loads. Starting with the 2005 edition, Visual Studio also added extensive 64-bit support. While the host development environment itself is only available as a 32-bit application, Visual C++ 2005 supports compiling for x86-64 as well as IA64. The platform SDK included 64-bit compilers and 64-bit versions of the libraries. Microsoft also announced Visual Studio Tools for Applications as the successor to Visual Basic for Applications and VSA. VSTA 1.0 was released to manufacturing along with Office 2007. It is included with Office 2007 and is also part of the Visual Studio 2005 SDK. VSTA consists of a customized IDE, based on the Visual Studio 2005 IDE, and a runtime that can be embedded in applications to expose its features via the .NET Object Model. Office 2007 applications continue to integrate with VBA, except for InfoPath 2007 which integrates with VSTA. Version 2.0 of VSTA was released in April 2008. It is significantly different from the first version, including features such as dynamic programming and support for WPF, WCF, WF, LINQ, and .NET 3.5 framework. Visual Studio 2008, Visual Studio 2008, and Visual Studio Team System 2008 codenamed AUKUS, were released to MSDN subscribers on November 19, 2007 alongside .NET Framework 3.5. The source code for the Visual Studio 2008 IDE is available under a shared source license to some of Microsoft's partners and ISVs. Microsoft released Service Pack 1 for Visual Studio 2008 on August 11, 2008. The internal version number of Visual Studio 2008 is version 9.0 while the file format version is 10.0. Visual Studio 2008 is the last version to support targeting Windows 2000 for C++ applications. Visual Studio 2008 is focused on development of Windows Vista, 2007 Office System, and web applications. For visual design, a new Windows Presentation Foundation Visual Designer and a new HTML CSS editor influenced by Microsoft Expression Web are included. J is not included. Visual Studio 2008 requires .NET 3.5 framework and by default configures compiled assemblies to run on .NET Framework 3.5, but it also supports multi-targeting which lets the developers choose which version of the .NET Framework the assembly runs on. Visual Studio 2008 also includes new code analysis tools, including the new Code Metrics tool. For Visual C++, Visual Studio adds a new version of Microsoft Foundation classes that add support for the visual styles and UI controls introduced with Windows Vista. For native and managed code interoperability, Visual C++ introduces the STLCLR, which is a port of the C++ standard template library containers and algorithms to managed code. STLCLR defines STL-like containers, iterators and algorithms that work on C++/CLI managed objects. Visual Studio 2008 features include an XAML-based designer, Workflow Designer, LINQ to SQL Designer, XSLT Debugger, JavaScript IntelliSense support, JavaScript debugging support, support for UAC manifests, a concurrent build system, among others. It ships with an enhanced set of UI widgets, both for Windows Forms and WPF. It also includes a multi-threaded build engine to compile multiple source files in a project across multiple threads simultaneously. It also includes support for compiling PNG compressed icon resources introduced in Windows Vista. An updated XML schema designer will ship separately sometime after the release of Visual Studio 2008. The Visual Studio Debugger includes features targeting easier debugging of multi-threaded applications. In debugging mode, in the Threads window, which lists all the threads, hovering over a thread will display the stack trace of that thread in tooltips. The threads can directly be named and flagged for easier identification from that window itself. In addition, in the code window, along with indicating the location of the currently executing instruction in the current thread. The currently executing instructions in other threads are also pointed out. The Visual Studio Debugger supports integrated debugging of the .NET 3.5 framework base class library, which can dynamically download the BCL source code and debug symbols and allows stepping into the BCL source during debugging. As of 2010, a limited subset of the BCL source is available, with more library support planned for later. Visual Studio 2010. On April 12, 2010, Microsoft released Visual Studio 2010, codenamed Dev 10, and .NET Framework 4. The Visual Studio 2010 IDE was redesigned, which, according to Microsoft, clears the UI organization and reduces clutter and complexity. The new IDE better supports multiple document windows and floating tool windows, while offering better multi-monitor support. The IDE shell has been rewritten using the Windows Presentation Foundation, whereas the internals have been redesigned using Managed Extensibility framework that offers more extensibility points than previous versions of the IDE that enabled add-ins to modify the behavior of the IDE. The new multi-paradigm ML variant F forms part of Visual Studio 2010. Visual Studio 2010 comes with .NET Framework 4 and supports developing applications targeting Windows 7. It supports IBM DB2 and Oracle databases, in addition to Microsoft SQL Server. It has integrated support for developing Microsoft's Silverlight applications, including an interactive designer. Visual Studio 2010 offers several tools to make parallel programming simpler. In addition to the parallel extensions for the .NET framework and the parallel patterns library for native code, Visual Studio 2010 includes tools for debugging parallel applications. The new tools allow the visualization of parallel tasks and their runtime stacks. Tools for profiling parallel applications can be used for visualization of thread wait times and thread migrations across processor cores. Intel and Microsoft have jointly pledged support for a new concurrency runtime in Visual Studio 2010, and Intel has launched parallelism support in Parallel Studio as an add-on for Visual Studio. The Visual Studio 2010 code editor now highlights references. Whenever a symbol is selected, all other usages of the symbol are highlighted. It also offers a quick search feature to incrementally search across all symbols and C++, C and VB.NET projects. Quick Search supports substring matches and camel case searches. The call hierarchy feature allows the developer to see all the methods that are called from a current method as well as the methods that call the current one. IntelliSense in Visual Studio supports a consume first mode which developers can opt into. In this mode, IntelliSense will not auto-complete identifiers. This allows the developer to use undefined identifiers and define those later. Visual Studio 2010 can also help in this by automatically defining them, if it can infer their types from usage. Current versions of Visual Studio have a known bug which makes IntelliSense unusable for projects using pure C. Visual Studio 2010 features a new help system replacing the MSDN library viewer. The help system is no longer based on Microsoft Help 2 and does not use Microsoft Document Explorer. Dynamic help containing links to related help topics based on where the developer was in the IDE has been removed in the shipping product, but can be added back using a download from Microsoft. Visual Studio 2010 no longer supports development for Windows Mobile prior to Windows Phone 7. Visual Studio 2010 Service Pack 1 was released in March 2011. Visual Studio Ultimate 2010. Visual Studio Ultimate 2010 is codenamed Rosario. It includes new modeling tools, such as the Architecture Explorer, which graphically displays projects and classes and the relationships between them. It supports UML activity diagram, component diagram, class diagram, sequence diagram, and use case diagram. Visual Studio Ultimate 2010 also includes test impact analysis, which provides hints on which test cases are impacted by modifications to the source code, without actually running the test cases. This speeds up testing by avoiding running unnecessary test cases. Visual Studio Ultimate 2010 also includes a historical debugger for managed code called Intelli Trace. Unlike a traditional debugger, that records only the currently active stack. Intelli Trace records all events, such as prior function calls, method parameters, events and exceptions. This allows the code execution to be rewound in case a breakpoint wasn't set where the error occurred. Debugging with Intelli Trace will cause the application to run more slowly than debugging without it, and will use more memory as additional data needs to be recorded. Microsoft allows configuration of how much data should be recorded, in effect allowing developers to balance speed of execution and resource usage. The lab management component of Visual Studio Ultimate 2010 uses virtualization to create a similar execution environment for testers and developers. The virtual machines are tagged with checkpoints which can later be investigated for issues, as well as to reproduce the issue. Visual Studio Ultimate 2010 also includes the capability to record test runs that capture the specific state of the operating environment as well as the precise steps used to run the test. These steps can then be played back to reproduce issues. Visual Studio 2012. Final build of Visual Studio 2012 was announced on August 1, 2012 and the official launch event was held on September 12, 2012. Unlike prior versions, Visual Studio 2012 cannot record and play macros and the macro editor has been removed. A major new feature is support for WinRT and C++/CX. Support for C++/AMP is also included. On September 16, 2011 a complete developer preview of Visual Studio 11 was published on Microsoft's website. Visual Studio 11 developer preview requires Windows 7, Windows Server 2008-02, Windows 8, or later operating systems. Versions of Microsoft Foundation class library and C runtime included with this release cannot produce software that is compatible with Windows XP or Windows Server 2003 except by using native multi-targeting and foregoing the newest libraries, compilers, and headers. However, on June 15, 2012, a blog post on the VC++ team blog announced that based on customer feedback, Microsoft would reintroduce native support for Windows XP targets in a version of Visual C++ to be released later in the fall of 2012. Visual Studio 2012 Update 1.0 was released in November 2012. This update added support for Windows XP targets and also added other new tools and features. On August 24, 2011, a blog post by Sumit Kumar, a program manager on the Visual C++ team, listed some of the features of the upcoming version of the Visual Studio C++ IDE, semantic colorization, improved syntax coloring, various user-defined or default colors for C++ syntax such as macros, enumerations, type names, functions etc. Reference highlighting, selection of a symbol highlights all of the references to that symbol within scope. New Solution Explorer. New Solution Explorer allows for visualization of class and file hierarchies within a solution project. Searching for calls to functions and uses of classes will be supported. Automatic display of IntelliSense list. IntelliSense will automatically be displayed whilst typing code, as opposed to previous versions where it had to be explicitly invoked through use of certain operators, or shortcut keys. Member list filtering. IntelliSense uses fuzzy logic to determine which functions types to display in the list. Code snippets. Code snippets are included in IntelliSense to automatically generate relevant code based on the user's parameters. Custom code snippets can be created. The source code of Visual Studio 2012 consists of approximately 50 million lines of code. Interface controversies. During Visual Studio 11 beta, Microsoft eliminated the use of color within tools except in cases where color is used for notification or status change purposes. However, the use of color was returned after feedback demanding more contrast, differentiation, clarity and energy in the user interface. In Visual Studio 2012 a major change to the interface is the use of all caps menu bar, as part of the campaign to keep Visual Studio consistent with the direction of other Microsoft user experiences, and to provide added structure to the top menu bar area. The redesign was criticized for being hard to read, and going against the trends started by developers to use camel case to make words stand out better. Some speculated that the root cause of the redesign was to incorporate the simplistic look and feel of Metro apps. However, there exists a Windows registry option to allow users to disable the all caps interface. Visual Studio 2013. The preview for Visual Studio 2013 was announced at the Build 2013 conference and made available on June 26, 2013. The Visual Studio 2013 RC was made available to developers on MSDN on September 9, 2013. The final release of Visual Studio 2013 became available for download on October 17, 2013 along with .NET 4.5.1. Visual Studio 2013 officially launched on November 13, 2013 at a virtual launch event keynoted by Sumo Ziga and hosted on events.visualstudio.com. Visual Studio 2013 Update 1 was released on January 20, 2014. Visual Studio 2013.1 is a targeted update that addresses some key areas of customer feedback. Visual Studio 2013 Update 2 was released on May 12, 2014. Visual Studio 14, the first CTP for Visual Studio 14 was announced and made available on June 3, 2014. The second CTP for Visual Studio 14 was announced and made available on July 8, 2014. Visual Studio Application Lifecycle Management. Visual Studio Application Lifecycle Management is a collection of integrated software development tools developed by Microsoft. These tools include IDEs, source control, work items, collaboration, metrics, and reporting tools. Visual Studio Application Lifecycle Management consists of 4 products: Visual Studio, which provides an IDE for development and client-side interfaces for the other products. Visual Studio Test Professional, which provides an IDE for software testers to create and execute tests. Team Foundation Server, which provides source code collaboration and data storage. Visual Studio Online, which is a TFS hosted in the cloud and offered as a service. Visual Studio Lab Management, which provides a way for software testers to create and manage virtual environments. In Visual Studio 2005 and Visual Studio 2008 the brand was known as Microsoft Visual Studio Team System. However, in October 2009, as part of the Visual Studio 2010 release, the Team System brand was renamed to Microsoft Visual Studio ALM. Visual Studio LightSwitch. Microsoft Visual Studio LightSwitch is an extension and framework specifically tailored for creating line-of-business applications built on existing .NET technologies and Microsoft platforms. The applications produced are architecturally 3-tier. The user interface runs on either Microsoft Silverlight, HTML5 client or as a SharePoint 2013 app. The Logic and Data Access tier is built on WCF data services and exposed as in a data feed hosted in ASP.NET. And the primary data storage supports Microsoft SQL Server Express, Microsoft SQL Server and Microsoft SQL Azure. LightSwitch also supports other data sources including Microsoft SharePoint, OData and WCF RIA services. LightSwitch includes graphical designers for designing entities and entity relationships, entity queries, and UI screens. Business logic may be written in either Visual Basic or Visual C. LightSwitch is included with Visual Studio 2012 Professional and Higher. The user interface layer is now an optional component when deploying a LightSwitch solution, allowing a service-only deployment. The first version of Visual Studio LightSwitch, released July 26, 2011, had many differences from the current release of LightSwitch. Notably, the tool was purchased and installed as a standalone product. If Visual Studio 2010 Professional or Higher was already installed on the machine, LightSwitch would integrate into that. The second major difference was the middle tier was built and exposed using WCF RIA services. See also, Microsoft Visual Studio Express, Microsoft Small Basic, References. External links, official website, Visual Studio Developers Center on MSDN, developing extension packages for Visual Studio using C, Microsoft Visual Studio at DMOZ.